the echo of silent sacrifices. The rain lashed against the window panes of the lonely cabin on the edge of the whispering woods. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of an old grandfather clock. Elias sat by the fireplace, his eyes closed, though it made no difference to the darkness he lived in. He didn't need sight to feel the tension in the air. He heard a stumble, a pair of frantic footsteps splashing through the mud outside. Then a desperate knock. "Please," a voice whispered from behind the door. It was feminine, trembling with a fear so cold it seemed to seep through the wood. "Please help me." Elias stood up, his movements practiced and calm. He opened the door, and the scent of rain and ozone rushed in, followed by the shivering figure of Clara. She looked at him, her eyes wide with terror, but she paused when she noticed his unseeing gaze. You're blind," she breathed, her voice cracking. "I see more than you think," Elias replied softly, reaching out a hand to steady her. "You are being hunted. Your heart is beating at a rate that suggests you haven't stopped running for miles." Clara collapsed into his arms, not out of weakness, but out of a sudden, overwhelming sense of safety. She had a bag clutched to her chest, a bag that contained a secret worth killing for. "They will come for me," she sobbed. "I should leave. I don't want to put you in danger." Elias tightened his grip on her shoulder. "In this house, the darkness is my ally, not yours. If they come, they will find that a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous opponent of all. Rest, Clara. I will watch the night for you." For the first time in years, Elias felt a spark of purpose. He led her to the worn-out sofa and covered her with a heavy woolen blanket. Clara looked at his scarred face, realizing that his strength didn't come from his muscles, but from his soul. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't even know my name." Elias turned his head toward the window, listening to the thunder. "Because everyone deserves a hand to hold when the world decides to turn its back. Tonight, I am your shield." The fireplace crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Clara watched Elias move. He didn't fumble or hesitate. He moved with a grace that defied his blindness. He poured a cup of herbal tea and placed it precisely on the small table near her hand. "Drink," he said. "It will settle your nerves." Clara took a sip, the warmth spreading through her shivering frame. "How did you lose your sight?" she asked, then immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked." "A bomb," Elias replied simply, sitting in the armchair opposite her. "I was a detective in the city. I tried to stop a shipment of illegal chemicals. I saved the city, but I lost the light. Now I prefer the silence of these woods." Suddenly, the wind outside seemed to change. The distant sound of a car engine struggling against the muddy uphill path reached Elias' ears long before Clara heard a thing. His posture shifted instantly. He leaned forward, his head tilted toward the door. "They are here," Elias whispered. Clara froze, the teacup trembling in her hands. "Already? But how?" "They tracked the GPS in your phone, or perhaps they knew this was the only road," Elias said, standing up. He reached behind the fireplace and pulled out a heavy iron poker. "Clara, listen to me very carefully. Go into the cellar behind the kitchen. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." "I can't leave you to face them alone." Clara stood up, her voice rising in panic. "They are armed, Elias. They are dangerous men." Elias turned his face toward her, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. "They think they are coming to an old man's house to reclaim a bag. They don't realize they are entering a labyrinth where I am the master. Your life is worth more than mine. Now go." Seeing the fierce determination in his sightless eyes, Clara realized that his sacrifice wasn't out of pity, but out of a deep-rooted sense of duty. She grabbed the bag and slipped into the shadows of the kitchen just as the headlights of a black SUV cut through the darkness outside, illuminating the rain-streaked windows like cold, accusing eyes. A heavy boot struck the front door. "Open up," a voice boomed over the thunder. "We know she's in there." Elias stood in the center of the dark room, the iron poker gripped firmly in his hand. He blew out the single candle on the table, plunging the cabin into absolute pitch-blackness. "Welcome to my world," he whispered to the empty air. The front door splintered open with a deafening crash. Two men stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the air like blades. But the beams found nothing but empty space. The cabin was a void of shadows. "We know you're here, old man," one of the men growled, his voice thick with a cold, professional menace. "Give us the girl and the bag and maybe you'll live to see the sunrise." Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. He was standing 3 feet away from them, pressed against the wall, breathing so shallowly it was as if he had become part of the house itself. In the pitch black, the intruders were clumsy. They tripped over the edge of the rug. They bumped into the heavy oak table. For Elias, the room was a map etched into his mind. He knew exactly where the floorboards creaked and where the ceiling dipped. He moved silently, a shadow within shadows. "I can't see a thing in here," the second man hissed, reaching for a light switch. He flipped it, but nothing happened. Elias had already cut the wires. Suddenly, Elias swung the iron poker. It whistled through the air, connecting with a sickening thud against the first man's arm, sending his handgun skittering across the floor. The man cried out in pain and fury. "He's right here." But by the time the second man turned his flashlight toward the sound, Elias was gone. He had slipped behind the heavy velvet curtains. From the cellar, Clara watched through a tiny crack in the floorboards. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the flashlights darting wildly, heard the heavy breathing of the hunters, and felt the immense weight of Elias' sacrifice. He was putting his life on the line for a stranger, using his disability as his greatest weapon. "Leave this place," Elias' voice echoed from a corner of the room, disorienting the men. "You are outmatched in the dark." The second intruder, panicked, began firing blindly into the shadows. The muzzle flashes illuminated the room for split seconds, staccato bursts of light that showed Elias ducking behind the stone fireplace. Clara realized she couldn't just hide. Elias was fighting for her, supporting her with a courage she didn't know existed. She looked at the bag in her hands, the evidence of their crimes. She took a deep breath, her fear turning into a cold, hard resolve. She wouldn't let his bravery be in vain. Elias heard the man reloading. It was the sound he had been waiting for. He lunged forward, not with a weapon, but with the intent to protect the one soul who had looked at him and seen a hero instead of a broken man. The struggle in the darkness intensified. The intruder swung his heavy flashlight like a club, but Elias sensed the displacement of air and stepped aside with a fluid motion. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the flashlight fell to the floor, its beam pointing toward the cellar door. "The girl!" the man shouted, seeing the light hit the wooden planks. Elias threw himself in front of the cellar entrance, blocking the path with his own body. He took a heavy blow to the shoulder, the pain radiating through his chest, but he didn't move. "You will not touch her," he gritted out through clenched teeth. Suddenly the cellar door creaked open from the inside. Clara didn't run away, she stepped out into the fray. In her hand, she held a heavy glass vase. As the intruder lunged toward Elias, Clara swung with all her might. The glass shattered against the man's head, dazing him just long enough for Elias to deliver a final, decisive strike with the iron poker. The room fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of the two survivors and the relentless drumming of the rain. The intruders lay unconscious on the floor. Clara dropped the remains of the vase, her hands shaking. She reached out and touched Elias' arm, finding the spot where he had been hit. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You took those hits for me." "It's just a bruise, Clara," Elias replied, though his voice was strained. He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek to find the tears he knew were there. "Why did you come out? You were safe in the dark." "I couldn't let you face the darkness alone anymore," Clara said, covering his hand with hers. "You gave me the courage to stop running. You supported me when I had nothing left. I had to support you, too." For the first time in years, the cold isolation in Elias' heart began to thaw. He realized that while he had been her shield, she had become his light. They weren't just two strangers in a storm anymore. They were two souls who had found strength in each other's sacrifices. "We need to leave," Elias said, his voice regaining its steady authority. "They have more men, and they will be following the SUV. I know a trail through the mountains where no car can follow. But it's a long walk, and it will be difficult." Clara looked at the bag of evidence, then at the man who had risked everything for her. She stood tall, wiping her eyes. "I'm ready. As long as we're together, I'm not afraid of the path." Elias nodded, picking up his walking stick and the bag. He reached out his other hand, and Clara took it firmly. Together, they stepped out of the broken door and into the pouring rain, leaving the cabin behind to face the mountain together. The mountain path was narrow and slick with mud, but Elias moved with a certainty that guided Clara through the treacherous terrain. The rain had turned into a soft mist, wrapping the forest in a ghostly silence. Every time Clara stumbled, Elias' hand was there, firm and unwavering, catching her before she could fall. "How do you know this path so well?" Clara asked, her breath coming in short gasps from the climb. "I spent 3 years walking these woods after I lost my sight," Elias replied, his voice calm despite the exertion. "Every tree, every rock, and every bend is a memory in my mind. You learn to trust the earth when you can no longer trust your eyes." They reached a high ridge where the wind howled through the pines. Below them, they could see the distant, flickering lights of search teams near the cabin they had abandoned. Clara felt a shiver of fear, but she looked at Elias' profile, strong, determined, and peaceful. His presence was a moral anchor that kept her from drifting into despair. "They will never stop looking for this diary, Elias," she said, clutching the bag tighter. "It contains names of people who think they are untouchable. By helping me, you've made yourself a target for the rest of your life." Elias stopped and turned toward her. Even in the dim light of dawn, his sightless eyes seemed to look right through the chaos of the world. "Clara, a life spent hiding in fear is not a life at home. I was a dead man in that cabin until you knocked on my door. You gave me back my purpose. If the price of doing what is right is a life on the run, then it is a price I pay gladly." His words sparked a fire in Clara. She realized that sacrifice wasn't a burden. It was a choice that defined who they were. She leaned in and kissed his cheek, a silent promise of loyalty. "Then we don't just run," Clara declared, her voice ringing with a newfound courage. "We find a way to get this evidence to the right people. We finish what we started together." Elias smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that reached his eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that. There is an old contact of mine in the next town, a journalist who hasn't been bought yet. If we can reach him by noon, the world will know the truth by sunset." As the first rays of the sun began to bleed through the gray clouds, illuminating the valley in gold, the two of them began their descent. They were exhausted and bruised, but their spirits were unbroken. They had found in each other a love that didn't need to be seen to be felt, a love built on the solid ground of mutual support and the ultimate sacrifice for the truth. The journey was far from over, but as they walked hand in hand into the morning light, they knew that no darkness could ever overshadow the strength they had found in the storm. The town below began to stir as the morning mist lifted, but Elias and Clara remained in the shadows of the forest edge, watching the main road. They could see a checkpoint. Men in suits stood beside local police, checking every vehicle. The corruption ran deeper than Clara had imagined. "They've blocked the way," Clara whispered, her heart sinking. "We'll never get past them to the journalist's office." Elias stood perfectly still, his ears filtering the sounds of the town. He heard the distant whistle of a freight train and the clanking of heavy machinery from the old industrial district. "The road is theirs," Elias said calmly. "But the underground belongs to those who know how to listen. There is a drainage system that runs from the mountain springs directly under the city square. It's narrow, dark, and cold, but it's a straight line to the press building." Clara looked at the dark, rusted iron grate of the tunnel entrance. It looked like a descent into another nightmare. She saw the exhaustion in Elias' face, the way he leaned slightly more on his stick, the blood that had dried on his sleeve. "Elias, you've done enough," she said, her voice trembling with love and concern. "Give me the directions. You stay here, hide in the woods where you're safe. I'll go through the tunnels." Elias reached out, finding her hand and squeezing it. "Clara, I didn't guide you through the storm just to let you go when the path got narrow. We are the two halves of a whole now. You are my eyes, and I am your shield. We go together or not at all." His unwavering moral support gave her the strength to push past her claustrophobia. They lowered themselves into the damp, echoing tunnels. For hours, they moved through the cramped space. Clara described every turn, every pipe, and every ladder, while Elias used his heightened sense of hearing to detect the footsteps of guards above them, telling her when to stop and when to move. It was a test of pure endurance and sacrifice. At one point, a rusted ladder rundle snapped under Clara's weight. Elias lunged blindly, catching her by the waist and hoisting her up with a burst of strength that left him gasping for air, his injured shoulder screaming in pain. "I've got you," he panted, his forehead resting against the cold stone wall. "I've always got you." Finally, they reached a heavy metal manhole cover. Above them, the muffled sound of printing presses thundered like a heartbeat. They had made it. As they climbed out into the basement of the newspaper office, covered in dust and grime but alive, they were met by a startled security guard. But before the man could react, an older man with gray hair and sharp eyes stepped out from the elevator. "Elias," the man gasped, looking at his old friend. "We heard you were dead. We heard the cabin was burned to the ground." "I'm very much alive, Miller," Elias said, straightening his back and pulling Clara forward. "And this is Clara. She has something that is going to change everything." Clara stepped forward and placed the bag on the table. She looked at Elias, whose sightless eyes were turned toward her with a look of immense pride. The sacrifice of their safety, the pain of the journey, and the terror of the night had led to this moment. a moment where justice was finally within reach. The journalist Miller wasted no time. Within minutes, the office was a whirlwind of activity. Documents were being scanned and files were being encrypted. Clara sat in a chair, finally letting the adrenaline fade, while a medic tended to the deep bruise on Elias' shoulder. "The story is breaking online in 10 minutes, Miller said, looking up from his screen. "The evidence is undeniable. The warrants are already being issued for the men who chased you. You did it, Elias. You both did." Clara looked at Elias. He was sitting quietly, his head tilted as he listened to the frantic typing and the ringing phones. The man who had been a ghost in the woods was now the center of a storm that would clean the city. "What happens now?" Clara asked softly, walking over to him. Elias reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Now the world knows your name for the right reasons. You don't have to run anymore, Clara. You can go back to your music. You can have your life back." Clara felt a lump in her throat. She looked at his scarred, tired face, the face of a man who had sacrificed his peace to give her a future. "But I don't want my old life back," she whispered. "Not if it means going back to the silence. You supported me when I was a stranger. You showed me what it means to be truly brave." Elias smiled, a soft, tired expression. "The woods will be very quiet without you, Clara, but you belong in the light." "Then we'll bring the light to the woods," Clara replied firmly. "I'm not leaving you, Elias. You told me we were two halves of a whole. That doesn't end just because the sun came up." For a moment, the busy newsroom seemed to disappear. There was only the two of them, the detective who had found his sight through his heart, and the musician who had found her voice through his courage. In the weeks that followed, the city was transformed. The corrupt fell and the truth prevailed. But far away from the headlines, in a small cabin on the edge of the Whispering Woods, a new sound could be heard. It wasn't just the ticking of a clock or the crackle of a fire. It was the sound of a piano, its notes drifting through the trees like a promise. Elias sat on the porch, the morning sun warming his face. He didn't need eyes to see the beauty around him. He could hear it in the music Clara played, and he could feel it in the way she stood beside him, her hand always within reach. They had sacrificed their old lives to build a new one, a life where no one had to face the darkness alone, and where every sacrifice was an echo of a love that had saved them both. The townspeople often told the story of the blind man and the girl with the diary, a story that gave heart to the hopeless and courage to the fearful. Their journey had ended, but their story, a story of moral strength and unwavering support, would live on forever. The news of the scandal's fallout reached the cabin through a small radio Miller had sent as a gift. The voices on the airwaves spoke of justice, of arrests, and of the mysterious heroes who had made it all possible. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of profound peace. Clara spent her afternoons composing music inspired by the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the call of the birds, and the steady breath of the man who had saved her. She realized that her music had changed. It was no longer a plea for help, but a song of triumph. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, Elias sat on the porch steps. He was holding a small wooden carving he had been working on by touch. It was a bird with its wings spread wide, ready to take flight. "Clara," he called out softly. She came to the door, leaning against the frame as she watched him. "Yes, Elias. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the day you arrived," he said, his fingers tracing the smooth curves of the wood. "I spent years thinking my darkness was a prison, but you showed me it was just a different way of seeing. You sacrificed your safety to stay with a man who couldn't even see your face." Clara sat down beside him, resting her head on his uninjured shoulder. "I didn't stay because I had to, Elias. I stayed because for the first time in my life I felt seen, not for what I had or what I could do, but for who I was. Your support gave me a spine of steel when I was ready to break." Elias handed her the wooden bird. "This is for you, a reminder that you are free. You can go anywhere in the world now. The shadows are gone." Clara took the carving, tears shimmering in her eyes. She looked at the path leading away from the cabin, then back at the man beside her. She knew that true freedom wasn't about the ability to leave. It was the choice to stay. "I am already where I want to be," she whispered. She took his hand and placed it over the wooden bird and then over her heart. In that moment, the sacrifice they had both made, the letting go of their fears and the opening of their hearts, became the foundation of a life that would inspire anyone who heard their tale. They had faced the worst of humanity and responded with the best of themselves. As the stars began to poke through the velvet sky, the cabin on the edge of the Whispering Woods stood as a testament to the fact that when two people support each other morally and spiritually, Even the deepest darkness can be turned into a beautiful, lasting light. The seasons turned, and the story of the cabin in the woods became a local legend. People in the nearby towns spoke of the guardian of the shadows and the lady of the music, using their tale to teach their children about the power of standing by someone when the world is at its darkest. One day, a young man from the town climbed the mountain path. He was a student who had lost his way, not just in the forest, but in life. He had been bullied and felt small, ready to give up on his dreams. He arrived at the cabin, exhausted and defeated. Elias, hearing the uneven rhythm of the young man's footsteps, met him at the gate. He didn't ask for his name or his business. Instead, he offered him a seat and a glass of cold water. Clara sat nearby, her presence a quiet comfort. "The climb is hard," Elias said, his voice resonant with experience. "But the view from the top is only possible because of the struggle. I once thought my life ended when the lights went out, but I learned that even in the dark, you can build something beautiful." The young man looked at the two of them, the man who stood tall despite his blindness, and the woman who looked at him with such unwavering respect. He heard the story of their sacrifice, of how they had risked everything not for fame, but for what was right. As he listened, the boy's shoulders straightened. The moral support Elias and Clara provided wasn't just words. It was a living example. He realized that his own struggles were not a reason to quit, but a reason to grow stronger. He saw that by helping others and sacrificing a bit of his own comfort, he could find a purpose far greater than himself. When the young man left the cabin that evening, he didn't just carry a map back to town. He carried a new heart. He told his friends, and they told theirs, and soon, the cabin became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking courage. Elias and Clara never asked for anything in return. They continued to live their quiet life, supporting each other in the small moments. A hand held during a storm, a song played during a lonely hour. Their love was a quiet flame that didn't need to roar to provide warmth. The final sacrifice they made was the sacrifice of their privacy, opening their home to those who needed to be reminded that goodness still exists. As the years passed, their legacy became a bridge over which many traveled from despair to hope. They proved that while one person can change a life, two people, standing together with courage and care, can change the world. Years later, a quiet evening descended upon the Whispering Woods. Elias and Clara sat together on the porch, watching a horizon they both understood in different ways. The radio, once filled with the chaos of the scandal, now played a symphony, a piece Clara had written and dedicated to the man who had taught her how to see in the dark. "It's beautiful, Clara," Elias whispered, his hand resting over hers. "I can hear the rain from that first night in the melody, but it sounds like peace now." "It's because of you," she replied softly. "You taught me that sacrifice isn't about losing something, it's about making room for something better. We lost our safety, but we found our souls." As the final notes of the music faded into the rustle of the leaves, a soft knock sounded at the garden gate. It wasn't a desperate knock like the one years ago, but a hesitant, respectful one. A young couple stood there, looking tired and worn, seeking the wisdom of the legendary pair they had heard so much about. Elias stood up, his posture as straight and commanding as the day he held the iron poker. He didn't need to see them to know they were at a crossroads. He reached out his hand, and Clara stepped up beside him, her presence a silent testament to a decade of unwavering support. "Come in," Elias said, his voice warm and inviting. "The path is long, and the world can be cold, but you don't have to walk it alone." The story of Elias and Clara didn't end with a grand finale or a sudden disappearance. It lived on in every person they encouraged, every soul they supported, and every heart they taught to be brave. They had become more than just a detective and a musician. They were the living proof that love is a choice to stay when everyone else leaves, and that sacrifice is the light that guides us all home. As they led the newcomers toward the warmth of the fireplace, the stars shone brightly over the cabin. The darkness was no longer a place of fear, but a canvas where their courage had painted a masterpiece of hope. Their journey was complete, and yet in the hearts of those they touched, it was only just beginning. The young couple sat by the fire, their eyes wide as they looked around the cabin. They spoke of the pressures of the modern world, the fear of making mistakes, and the weight of responsibilities that felt too heavy to bear. They felt like they were failing because life wasn't easy. Elias leaned forward, the firelight catching the gray in his hair. "Strength is not the absence of struggle," he said, his voice steady and calm. "It is the decision to keep your heart open while you fight. When I lost my sight, I thought my strength was gone because I could no longer fight with my fists. But Clara taught me that true strength is being the person someone else can lean on when they are tired. Clara brought over a tray of tea, her movements graceful. There will be times, she added, looking at the young woman, when you feel you have nothing left to give. That is when sacrifice matters most. It's not about giving up your life, it's about giving up your pride to help the person you love. It's about being a moral support when the rest of the world is judging them. The couple listened, and slowly the tension left their faces. They saw in Elias and Clara a partnership that had been forged in fire and polished by time. They realized that their own problems weren't signs of failure, but opportunities to grow closer. As the couple prepared to leave later that night, they looked back at the cabin. It was just a small house in the woods, but to them, it felt like a lighthouse. They walked down the mountain path not with a solution to all their problems, but with the courage to face them together. Elias and Clara stood at the door until the sound of the footsteps faded. The night was quiet, filled with the scent of pine and the cool mountain air. "Do you ever regret it?" Elias asked suddenly. "Staying here in the quiet instead of the grand stages of the world?" Clara turned to him, taking his face in her hands. She looked at the man who had been her shield, her mentor, and her greatest love. "The grandest stage in the world is right here, Elias, because here we get to see the impact of a life lived for others. I wouldn't trade one night in this silence for 1,000 standing ovations." They went inside and closed the door, the warmth of the cabin sealing out the cold. Their story was no longer just about a detective and a musician. It was a manual for the soul. It taught that as long as there is one person willing to sacrifice for another, and one person willing to support another's spirit, the darkness will never truly win. And so the light in the window of the cabin stayed lit, a small, golden spark in the vast woods, telling the world that hope is always home. As the years stretched into a gentle sunset, the cabin became a sanctuary not just for people, but for the stories they left behind. The walls were now lined with letters from across the country, messages from people who had found their own mountain paths and conquered them because of the legend of the Whispering Woods. One evening, Elias sat in his favorite chair, his breath slower now, his hands resting on the worn arms of the wood. He listened to the wind, but it didn't sound like a storm anymore. It sounded like a conversation with old friends. Clara sat at his feet, her hand resting on his knee. "Clara," Elias whispered, his voice thin but clear. "I can feel the light again. It's not the light of the sun, but the light of every person we helped. It's bright, Clara. It's so bright." Clara squeezed his hand, her heart aching with a bittersweet beauty. She knew that the ultimate sacrifice was approaching, the moment where one must let go so the other can find peace. But she didn't feel afraid. The moral support they had built between them was a bridge that even death could not break. "You taught me how to walk in the dark, Elias," she said, her voice a steady melody of love. "If you have to go ahead of me, I won't be lost. I'll just follow the music we made together." Elias smiled, and for a moment he looked like the young detective again, fierce, protective, and full of life. "We didn't just survive the darkness, did we? We made it beautiful." That night, Elias passed away peacefully, surrounded by the silence he had mastered and the love he had earned. But the story didn't end there. Clara stayed in the cabin. She didn't mourn with bitterness, but with a profound sense of gratitude. She continued to welcome the lost, to play her music, and to tell the story of the man who saw with his soul. She showed the world that even when the person you love is gone, the sacrifice they made for you remains an eternal flame. The echo of silent sacrifices became more than a title. It became a truth. Every time a stranger helped another, every time someone stood up for justice at a personal cost, and every time a broken heart found the courage to care again, the echo of Elias and Clara's life rang out. In the end, their story taught the most important lesson of all, that our lives are not measured by what we take from the world, but by what we give up for the sake of another. And in that giving we find a love that is truly, forever, attractive and Kubsarat. The legacy of the cabin did not fade with time. It grew into a movement. Clara, now a woman of silver hair and steady hands, spent her days mentoring young storytellers and musicians who traveled from far and wide. She taught them that art was not about fame, but about providing a moral compass for those lost in the fog of life. One morning, a young girl arrived at the gate, carrying a violin case and a heavy heart. She had heard that this was the place where shadows turned into strength. Clara greeted her with the same warmth Elias once had. "My music feels empty," the girl confessed, her voice trembling. "I play the notes, but there is no soul in them. I am afraid I have nothing to give." Clara took the girl to the porch, where the wind whispered through the trees. "Soul is not something you are born with," Clara said gently. "It is something you earn through sacrifice. It comes when you decide to play not for yourself, but for the person who is suffering in silence. When you use your music to support someone else's spirit, you will find your own." The girl stayed for a month, learning to listen to the silence of the woods just as Elias had. She watched how Clara lived, simply with purpose, and with an unwavering commitment to the memory of the man who had been her shield. When it was time for the girl to leave, she stood at the gate and played a final piece. It was a melody of such courage and beauty that it seemed to wake the very forest. It was the sound of a heart that had learned to sacrifice its ego for the sake of true connection. "Thank you," the girl whispered. "I know now that I am never truly alone as long as I have the courage to care for others." Clara watched her walk down the mountain, knowing that another spark of light had been sent into the world. She returned to the cabin and sat in Elias' chair, feeling his presence in the quiet air. She realized that their story was an eternal loop, a chain of sacrifices that would never end. The audio of their life was a masterpiece, recorded in the hearts of thousands. It was a story of a blind detective and a frightened musician who chose to become legends of love. It taught the world that the greatest attractive power is not beauty or wealth, but the strength to say, "I will stand by you, no matter the cost." As the sun set one last time over the whispering woods, the music continued. It wasn't just coming from the cabin anymore. It was coming from every corner of the world where someone chose kindness over fear. The echo of their silent sacrifices had become a roar of hope, a beautiful and attractive force that would never be silenced. The final chapter of this journey arrived not with a loud celebration, but with a peaceful realization. Clara had reached a great age, and the cabin was now a place of pilgrimage for those who sought to understand the true meaning of Himmat, courage. One evening, as the stars began to crown the whispering woods, Clara sat on the porch for the last time. She held Elias' old wooden bird carving in her lap. Her hands were wrinkled, but her spirit was as bright as the day she had first knocked on his door in the rain. She looked out at the valley below. She could see the lights of the town where justice had once been a dream, but was now a reality. She saw the lights of a new school named after Elias, where children were taught that helping others was the highest form of success. "We did it, Elias," she whispered to the wind. "The sacrifice was worth every moment, the support we gave each other. It didn't just save us, it changed everything." She felt a gentle breeze brush against her cheek, almost like a familiar hand. She knew her time had come to rejoin the man who had been her shield. She wasn't afraid. She had lived a life that was attractive not because of glamour, but because of its purity. She had shown that a woman could find her strength not by running from her past, but by standing firm for her future. The next morning, the townspeople found the cabin empty of life, but full of light. On the table, Clara had left a final message for whoever would find it. It was a simple note that read, "To the one who finds this, do not mourn the silence. The music is not gone, it has simply moved into your heart. When you see someone in the dark, be their light. When you see someone falling, be their shield. The greatest sacrifice is to live for others, and the greatest reward is the love that follows." The story of the echo of silent sacrifices was finally complete. It was a story that started in a storm and ended in a symphony. It was a novel that taught that no matter how blind or broken we feel, we all have the power to morally support another human being. This was the beautiful, suspenseful, and deeply moving tale of two souls who proved that sacrifice is not an ending, but the most Kubsarat beginning of all. The legend of the cabin did not vanish into history. Instead, it transformed into a living sanctuary. The townspeople decided that the cabin should never be sold or torn down. It became a home for those who had lost everything, a place where the broken could come to find their strength again. A young man, who had once been one of the many children helped by the school named after Elias, became the new guardian of the house. He was an artist, and he spent his days restoring the old wood and keeping the fireplace burning. He understood that the cabin was not made of timber and stone, but of the moral courage Elias and Clara had left behind. Every year on the anniversary of that first rainy night, people from all over the world would gather at the base of the mountain. They wouldn't bring flowers, they would bring stories. They told tales of how they had sacrificed their own comfort to help a neighbor, or how they had found the Himmat to stand up against injustice because they had heard the audio novel of Elias and Clara's life. The story had reached the ears of millions. People listening to the audio recording in far-off cities felt their hearts swell with a newfound resolve. They realized that suspense in life isn't about what happens next, but about whether we choose to be brave in the moments that matter. In the very last scene of this long journey, the young guardian sat on the porch, just as Elias and Clara once had. He looked at the wooden bird carving, which now sat in a glass case inside the window. He picked up a pen and added a final line to the archives of the cabin. Love is not a feeling we wait for, it is a sacrifice we make. Support is not a gift we give, it is a duty we owe to one another. And though the voices of the past may fade into the wind, their echo will guide us through every storm yet to come. The whispering woods finally fell into a deep, contented silence. The darkness was no longer a place where villains hid, but a place where heroes were made. The attractive, beautiful, and courageous story of the blind detective and the brave musician was now etched into the stars, forever reminding the world that even in the deepest night, a single act of sacrifice can light the way for generations. The end. The message of the cabin continued to ripple through time, proving that a truly moral life never truly ends. Decades after Clara had joined Elias, the town below had grown into a city of light, but the mountain remained a sacred space of silence. A new tradition had started. Every year, a walk of silence was held, where people would climb the path without speaking, using only their senses to guide them, just as Elias had once done. It was a way for them to practice the courage of trusting something deeper than their sight, to trust their inner strength and the person walking beside them. One particular traveler, a woman who had lost her way in the cutthroat world of business, reached the porch. She sat where Clara had once sat and looked at the valley. She felt the weight of the echo in the air. She realized that she had been sacrificing her peace for power, but here, she learned that the only sacrifice worth making was the one that uplifted another soul. She left her expensive watch on the porch railing, a symbolic gesture of leaving behind the ticking pressure of the world, and replaced it with a simple promise to become a mentor to someone in need back home. The story of the cabin taught everyone that we are all recorders of our own audio novels. Every day, our actions write the script. Every act of care, every moment we choose to support someone morally instead of judging them, adds a beautiful note to the grand symphony of humanity. As the moonlight bathed the whispering woods in a silver glow, the cabin stood as a timeless monument. It wasn't just a story about the past, it was a guide for the future. It told every listener that no matter how much you have lost, you still have the power to be someone's hero. The suspense of the unknown future didn't feel scary anymore. It felt like an invitation to be brave. And in that bravery, the world found a beauty that was more attractive than any gold or fame. The echo of Elias and Clara remained, a soft, persistent heartbeat in the dark, reminding everyone that as long as we care for each other, the light will never truly go out. The story of the cabin eventually became a global symbol of hope, moving beyond the whispering woods and into the hearts of people who had never even seen the mountain. In schools, offices, and homes, people began to use the phrase, the Elias choice, whenever they had to decide between their own safety and doing what was right for someone else. One winter, a heavy snowstorm trapped a group of travelers near the base of the mountain. Among them was a man who was bitter and cold-hearted, having spent his life looking out only for himself. As the temperature dropped, he saw a young family struggling to keep their child warm. In that moment, he remembered the audio novel he had heard about the blind man who became a shield for a stranger. For the first time in his life, the man took off his own heavy coat and wrapped it around the shivering child. He spent the night staying awake, keeping a small fire going and offering words of encouragement to the terrified parents. He realized that by sacrificing his own comfort, he had found a warmth that no fire could provide, the warmth of human connection. When they were finally rescued, the man didn't go back to his old ways. He traveled up to the cabin, which was now a beautifully preserved museum of courage. He stood before the portraits of Elias and Clara and realized that their sacrifice was a seed that had finally bloomed in him. He left a small note on the message board. "I was blind even with my eyes open until I heard your story. Thank you for teaching me how to see." The cabin stood through the snow and the sun, a silent witness to the changing world. It proved that while bodies may fade, a moral legacy is immortal. The suspense of life, the fear of the unknown, is managed not by knowing what will happen, but by knowing who you will be when it does. As the wind whistled through the chimney of the cabin, it carried with it the laughter of the children in the valley, the music of new composers, and the steady, quiet heartbeat of a world that was slowly learning to care. The attractive power of Elias and Clara's love had become a permanent part of the atmosphere, a beautiful reminder that we are all, in our own way, protectors of the light. The years turned into centuries, and the world changed in ways Elias and Clara could never have imagined. Cities grew tall, technology advanced, and the way people communicated evolved, but the human heart remained the same. It still craved the same things: connection, courage, and a reason to believe in the goodness of others. The cabin in the Whispering Woods was no longer just a physical building. It had become a universal metaphor. In digital archives and global libraries, the story of the blind detective and the storyteller was labeled as the ultimate blueprint for human support. One day, a young historian was researching the old world and came across the original audio recordings of the legend. As she listened to the description of the night Clara first knocked on the door, she felt a profound sense of clarity. She realized that in her modern, fast-paced life, she had forgotten the power of Kamash Kuabani, silent sacrifice. She decided to visit the site where the cabin once stood. Though the original wood had long ago returned to the earth, the area was now a beautiful, protected park. In the center stood a simple monument, two hands carved from stone, joined together, holding a small wooden bird. As she sat by the monument, she noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench nearby. He was a caretaker of the park, and despite his age, he had a look of immense peace. "You look like you found what you were searching for," the old man said with a smile. "I was looking for the secret to their strength," the historian replied. "How did they keep going when everything was against them?" The old man looked toward the horizon, where the sun was setting behind the peaks. "They didn't look at the mountain they had to climb," he whispered. "They only looked at the person standing next to them. They realized that when you support someone else, you find a strength you didn't know you had. Their life wasn't a story of pain, but a story of Himat and Mohabbat." The historian realized then that the most attractive thing about their story wasn't the suspense or the danger. It was the simple, beautiful truth that no soul is ever truly lost if another soul is willing to find it. She returned to her city and wrote a new book, not about history, but about the future. She taught a new generation that the greatest technology we possess is our ability to be a moral shield for one another. And so the echo of the silent sacrifices continued. It moved through the air, through the wires, and through the very souls of humanity. It remained a beautiful, attractive, and eternal song, a reminder that as long as we choose to sacrifice our ego for the sake of love, the light of the Whispering Woods will never, ever fade. The final echo, the legacy of the Whispering Woods, had now transcended time and space, becoming a guiding light for a new era of humanity. People no longer saw the story of Elias and Clara as just a tragic tale of the past, but as a living manual for how to treat one another with dignity and grace. In a world that was becoming increasingly fast and digital, their silent sacrifices reminded everyone to slow down and listen to the heartbeat of their fellow man. A global initiative was started, inspired by the notes Clara had left behind. It was called the Echo Project. Its goal was simple: to encourage people to perform one act of moral support every day without seeking credit or fame. This movement spread like wildfire, proving that the most attractive thing a human can possess is not beauty or power, but the courage to be a shield for someone else's soul. In the center of a bustling modern city, a massive digital monument was erected. It didn't show faces, but rather silhouettes of two people, one standing tall and protective, the other reaching out with trust. Every time someone in the world performed a selfless act, a small light would flicker on the monument. Within a year, the entire structure was glowing so brightly that it could be seen from the sky, a beacon of hope for a world that had once been lost in the dark. The story reached its final, most beautiful realization, that Elias and Clara were not special because of their circumstances, but because of their choice. They chose to believe in each other when the world had given up. They chose to sacrifice their safety for the sake of truth, and in doing so, they created a melody that would never end. As the wind continues to blow through the trees of the mountain where it all began, the echo remains. It tells us that as long as one person is willing to stand by another, the darkness will always be defeated. The suspense of life is over, replaced by the peace of knowing that love, when built on sacrifice and moral support, is the only force that truly lasts forever. This is the eternal echo of the Whispering Woods, a story that started with a knock in the rain and ended with a world full of light. The final echoes of the legacy began to weave into the very fabric of the future, where the story was no longer just a legend, but a way of life. The Valley of Vision became a place where the air itself seemed to carry the resonance of Elias' strength and Clara's music. It was said that if you stood perfectly still near the ruins of the cabin, you could still hear a faint, beautiful melody carried by the wind, a melody that offered comfort to anyone who had lost their way. As generations passed, the story inspired a new kind of leader, those who didn't lead by power, but by the weight of their sacrifice. These leaders were taught that true authority comes from the ability to protect the vulnerable, just as the blind detective had protected the musician. The world began to shift from a place of competition to a place of collective moral support, proving that the seeds planted in a small, dark cabin could grow to shade the entire planet. One evening, a young child asked their grandfather if Elias and Clara were real or just a beautiful dream. The old man looked up at the stars and replied, "They are as real as the courage in your heart." They were two people who decided that even if they couldn't save the whole world, they could be the whole world for each other. And because of that choice, the darkness never had a chance. The story finally rested in the great library of human existence, recorded not in ink, but in the kindness of strangers and the loyalty of friends. The suspense of their struggle had turned into a symphony of peace. It was an attractive, timeless truth. That sacrifice is the language of love, and support is the bridge to hope. In the quiet of the whispering woods, the golden light in the window finally merged with the sunrise. The journey of the detective and the singer was complete, leaving behind a world that was no longer afraid of the shadows, for they had learned that every shadow is simply a place where the light is about to break through. The eternal symphony. The world eventually reached a point of absolute silence, not a silence of peace, but a silence of uncertainty. As technology reached its peak, people began to feel more disconnected than ever before. In this cold, digital age, a great crisis arose where a global communication failure left millions in isolation and fear. For a moment, it seemed as if the darkness that Elias and Clara had fought so hard against was finally returning to claim the world. During this great blackout, a group of people found themselves stranded in a remote, frozen wasteland. Without their devices or maps, they were helpless and losing hope. Just as despair began to set in, an elderly woman among them started to hum a melody. It was the same tune that Clara had once played in the Whispering Woods. She began to tell the story of the blind detective who walked through the dark without fear because he carried the light in his soul. Inspired by the story, the group stopped panicking and began to work together. Those who were strong carried those who were weak. Those who were afraid found himmat, in the words of those who stayed calm. They realized that they didn't need a digital signal to find their way. They needed the moral support that Elias and Clara had modeled centuries ago. They became each other's eyes and each other's shields, carving a path through the snow just like the mountain path of the Whispering Woods. When the group finally reached safety, they realized that the crisis had been a final test for humanity. The story of Elias and Clara had acted as a spiritual compass when all other tools failed. It proved that their legacy was not a dusty piece of history, but a living, breathing force of survival. The attractive power of the echo had saved them, not through magic, but through the simple, beautiful act of human sacrifice. As the sun rose over the recovered world, people everywhere began to realize that the most important thing they could ever record was not data, but the strength they gave to one another in the dark. The symphony was reaching its final, most powerful movement. As the world emerged from its final test, a new sense of peace settled over the earth. It was as if the spirits of Elias and Clara had finally completed their mission, seeing their lessons written in the actions of a grateful humanity. In the quiet of the Valley of Vision, a soft, golden mist began to glow around the ancient monument, signaling the beginning of the spiritual conclusion to their journey. In this beautiful moment, it felt as though the veil between the past and the present grew thin. Those who visited the site spoke of a profound feeling of being watched over by a protective strength and a melodic grace. People began to realize that Elias and Clara had never truly left. They had simply moved from the cabin into the very breath of the world. Their love had become a constant, invisible frequency that anyone could tune into whenever they felt the weight of a sacrifice. On the highest peak of the mountain, a new kind of light appeared, a soft, pulsing rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the forest. It was the eternal signal, a reminder that no act of kindness is ever lost. The story had evolved into a spiritual truth. that when we give of ourselves for another, we are not losing anything. We are becoming part of something immortal. The attractive force of their legacy was now a gravity that held the moral world together. Elias' silence and Clara's song had finally merged into a single, perfect harmony. This harmony taught the world that the greatest beauty is found in the moments when we choose to be brave for someone else's sake. The suspense of the struggle had faded into the serenity of a job well done. As the stars twinkled above the whispering woods, they seemed to reflect the millions of small acts of support happening across the globe. The journey was now approaching its grand finale. The world was no longer a place of isolated shadows, but a tapestry of light, woven together by the threads of silent sacrifices. The legacy of the blind man who saw with his heart, and the woman who found her voice in the dark, had become the most Kubsarat truth ever told. The time had finally come for the grand finale of the Eternal Symphony. In this closing chapter, the story of the Whispering Woods reached its ultimate destination, not in a book or a monument, but in the soul of every living being. The final act was a message of hope that transcended the boundaries of time, proving that love is the only legacy that never fades. In the quietest hour of the night, a soft, radiant light filled the sky, reflecting off the peaks where the cabin once stood. It was a moment of global reflection, where every person felt a sudden, deep connection to the strangers around them. They realized that the echo of silent sacrifices was not a story about two people from the past, but a story about the potential for greatness within themselves. Elias and Clara had been the spark, but humanity was now the flame. The final recording of their life was not an audio file, but the collective heartbeat of a world that had chosen kindness over fear. The suspense of human existence, the fear of being alone in the dark, was permanently replaced by the beautiful certainty that we are all shields for one another. The attractive power of their himmat had created a world where no one had to walk through the storm without a hand to hold. As the sun rose for the final time in this narrative, the Whispering Woods became a place of pure light. The spirits of the blind detective and the musician were seen one last time, standing on the porch of a cabin made of starlight. They looked out at the beautiful world they had helped create, smiled at each other, and finally stepped into the dawn, their voices merging with the wind. The final message left for the world was simple yet profound. Your life is the most beautiful story ever written. Do not be afraid of the sacrifices, for they are the notes that make your music eternal. Support one another, love without limits, and remember that even in the deepest silence, your goodness creates an echo that will ring through forever. The symphony was complete. The cabin was gone, the actors had left the stage, but the light remained. The story of the echo of silent sacrifices was no longer a novel. It was the truth of the human spirit, a beautiful and attractive force that would light the way for all eternity. The end.